All right. Well, welcome back. We're going to be exploring today the issue of politics and social ethics more broadly. That is, when we think about ethics as a field, we're often talking about the individual making choices, how the individual decides what's ethical or not, how to get individuals to act ethically. But there are times that we work together as a community for shared goals in a kind of social ethical framework. We have shared values and want to work for a shared cause, and that's a kind of social ethics. And on the philosophical level, there's the whole question of how should we organize our society? Human beings have always lived in some kind of community, and so we have to discuss what are some of the options for how we might organize our group activities. The best expression of Jewish political life I've ever found actually appears in a Monty Python movie called The Life of Brian, where there's an early scene where Brian has decided he hates the Romans and he wants to work against them, and so he meets an organization called the People's Front of Judea. And he says, "I thought you were the Judean People's Front." "Oh, we hate the Judean People's Front." So the People's Front of Judea hates the Judean People's Front, and the Judean People's Front hates the People's Front of Judea, and they all hate the Popular Front for the Liberation of Judea, which is one person. So the idea of fragmenting political allegiances that don't seem to have a clear separation and mission, well, this unfortunately is how a lot of historical Jewish politics is run. There is actually a fabulous book by Ezra Mendelsohn called On Modern Jewish Politics, which talks about Jewish political organization and life in the 20th century, the early part of the 20th century, talking about what life was like for Jews organizing Jewish political parties in Poland, for example, in the interwar period between World War I and World War II. There were a variety of Jewish parties running for office, and some of them became the ancestors of the Israeli political parties that we see today. Obviously, Israel is an example of Jewish political organization along different political, religious, and ethnic cultural lines. But the best expression of Jewish political life is that Judean People's Front versus the People's Front of Judea. Or the other example is a story about the earliest Jewish shared construction project. So the story goes that two brothers lived on opposite sides of a hill, and there was a famine. And so one brother decided to sneak food over to his brother on the other side of the hill, and the second brother did the same to the first. And one night they met each other on the top of the hill. They realized what their brother was doing, and they embraced, and this is the hill on which the Jerusalem temple would be built. But the alternate version of that story, which is more relevant to our topic today, is two brothers on either side of a hill are facing a famine, but the first brother goes over to the other brother's side and steals his grain and brings it back, and the second brother does the same to the first brother. They meet one night on the top of the mountain, and they realize what the other is doing. They fall to blows and fighting each other, and this is the mountain on which they build the Israeli Knesset parliament building. So that again reflects some of that what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours, versus what's yours is mine, and how politics works. And sometimes our self-interest versus the collective interest does not win out. But we know that human beings have always been organized in some fashion. Aristotle famously said man is by nature a political animal. And remember, the word politics comes from the Greek word polis, the city or the city-state. There was no such thing as a state of nature, a la Rousseau, where individuals were floating around in a bubble and created a contract together. It's a useful theory to understand rights and responsibilities in the individual and the group, as we talked about last time. But we've always had some kind of group, and there's always been some kind of organization in that group. And once you've organized the group, then there's what is the group going to do? So this is the two parts of what we're talking about today: the politics of how you organize the group, and the social action and social ethics of what do we do once we have a group organized. Now, there are a few options for organization that actually have been tried out in Jewish history. If we learn from the Jewish experience, we can look back at some of those. So the earliest example of political organization we see, both archaeologically and in the Hebrew Bible, is a system of judges or chieftains. The word shofet in Hebrew does mean judge. It's the same root as mishpat, which is judgment or court decision. But the judges in the book of Judges are really more kind of tribal chieftains. They have a temporary power. They don't pass it on necessarily to a child to take over after them. They lead the people in battle, and they're successful, and that's about as far as it goes. And they don't seem to have a particularly judicial function as far as we can tell. But these temporary chieftains are a kind of monarchy, or ruled by one person, but they're ad hoc, as needed, and then things go back to the tribal chieftains and sort of a confederacy of chieftains, and then that breaks down, and in the end, in the Hebrew Bible's narrative, a new model shows up that requires a response. The Israelites are being conquered by the Philistines, who are a Greek people coming from elsewhere in the Mediterranean with iron weapons, and so the Hebrews say to God, give us a king like all other peoples have, who can lead us in battle and lead us to victory. And so they shift from this tribal chieftain model and the judges to a monarchy ruled by a king. First you have King Saul, who was killed in battle, obviously failing in his one job. You had one job, Saul, it was lead us in battle and win, and he fails, and so he dies. And then King David takes over after him. The book of Samuel is actually a fascinating exploration of the politics and maneuvering that David goes through in dealing with Saul, sort of a masterclass in realpolitik, actually. And then David is able to pass on his kingship to his son Solomon with his own court intrigues with other sons that are rivals to David and rebel against him and so on. So he has his own tension. Ultimately, Solomon takes over. Solomon fails as a king, and the kingdom splits into two, a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. We cover all this in the history class. But suffice it to say that even the northern and southern kingdoms, which are kingdoms with kings, are unstable, have revolutions that overturn them, fighting with each other or fighting with outside powers. The monarchy doesn't last in Jewish life, because by the end of that period, around the year 586 BCE, both the northern and southern kingdom have been conquered by outside powers. The kings have been destroyed. In fact, the last king of Judah, Zedekiah, has all of his sons killed in front of him, and then his eyes are put out. And what does that do? It means there's no heirs, but the king still lives. So you can't start a new monarchy, but the king is impotent because he can't see anymore and is taken away into exile in Babylon. And that's more or less where the line of David vanishes. There's still hope that a king will return. If you've ever heard of a Messiah, well, that's the Hebrew word Mashiach, which means anointed with oil, because the kings were anointed with oil. By the way, the Greek for anointed is Christos. So it's not that Jesus' last name was Christ, it's his title, Jesus the Christ.
Well, I knew
he
that,
is the anointed one, just like the Mashiach would be the anointed one. And actually, if you read the genealogy down to Joseph, it goes through David in one of the Gospels. I think it's the Gospel of Matthew.
Yeah, I forget which one.
I think it's Matthew. But in any case, that's again to make a claim, although ironically, Joseph has nothing to do with Jesus' parentage, if you read that gospel. But the claim is there's some.
That's a good point.
The claim is there's some line to David, and David's the Messiah. Or if you've celebrated Passover in a traditional household, there's a song called Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet. Eliyahu Hanavi. And then the middle part of that line is, come soon, Elijah the prophet, with Moshiach ben David, with the Messiah, son of David. So the idea of the king as the ideal political model for Israelite Hebrew community still is sort of subterranean or even sometimes explicit in Rabbinic Judaism, but there's not a lot of push to do that, and I'll explain why in a second.
Where's Jesse fit into that?
Jesse's the father of David.
Okay, that's her.
He's the so the line of Jesse.
Okay.
It's another way of saying the line of David.
Right.
Yeah. A shoot will come out from
Yeah, that's
Jesse
what
or something like that.
I was thinking, yeah,
in Isaiah,
trying to
yeah.
figure out what that was.
Yeah, so it's all the line of David
makes
claim.
sense.
Because again, that's the rightful line of kings, so the new king has to come from that line.
And that's a different tribe than Saul.
That's right. Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin,
right.
and David's from the tribe of Judah.
Right, okay.
Now, after this exile in Babylon that I mentioned, there's a new form of government that takes over, and they decide to de-emphasize the kings. This new form of government is government by priests. Ezra the priest rebuilds the temple, reestablishes the system of rule there under a new document. It's a kind of priestly constitution. We today call it the Torah. And the Torah has two major figures. You have Moses and Aaron. Moses is the prophet, Aaron is the priest. And in the end, Aaron passes on his mantle to his grandson Sadok, who takes over as priest after Aaron. Moses dies and nobody knows where he's buried, and there's no prophet ever like Moses ever again. So any modern day prophets that are wandering around telling you what to do, just ignore them. Because we have the written document from the best prophet ever that left the priests in charge. And the priests are the ones who get to tell you what the document means, because they're the literate ones, and they're the ones authorized by the document to rule everything and to run it from the temple in Jerusalem. Now, what do you call government by priests?
Theocracy.
It's a theocracy, right? Which technically means government by God, except God doesn't answer his messages particularly well.
Bad on email.
Right, he's bad on email, not responsive. So he has deputies, and the deputies are the ones who are really running things in his name. That's a theocracy.
Very, very convenient.
Yeah, well, as it works out, right? Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Right, exactly.
So the
Well, they
priests,
weren't the only ones to use that.
No. The Catholic
There's plenty.
hierarchy is very clear.
for sure. I mean, even the Egyptians had the God-King model where they were, both at once. So yes, the idea of theocracy is not unique to Hebrews, but there was one for sure, ruled by priests, and actually that transitioned relatively smoothly after the temple was destroyed to the rabbis, which is another kind of theocracy. Now, the difference between the priestly theocracy and the rabbinic theocracy was that the priestly theocracy was hereditary. We had high priests and high priestly families and Levites who were the attendants, but that was a clan as well, and it was biological, that was defining who the priestly class would be. For the rabbis, there were a few honors given to people who were hereditary priests, who had the last name Cohen or Levite, and so they got a few special things, but to be a rabbi did not require pedigree. In that sense, it was democratic. Now, to study, perhaps you need some affluence to be able to do it, but actually most of the rabbis in the early rabbinic period had a job. They were leather makers and sandal makers, and some of them were independently wealthy or married well, but there wasn't an assumption that your job was being a rabbi. You earned a living doing one thing, and you were a rabbi by knowledge and learning. And there's even famous stories of people like Rabbi Akiva who didn't start studying until he was 40 years old, and whose wife had to sell her hair to help him afford to study, and he managed to become one of the preeminent rabbis as a story of this meritocracy. Now, I'll put that in quotes because, of course, women weren't allowed to be rabbis, okay? So you have half of the population automatically disqualified. This is a world that accepts slavery, okay? So it's not a race slavery the way that we have it. It's more of legal slavery like in the Roman Empire and other places. It's very common in the area as well, but the rabbis accepted it as the way of things. So you have this rule by rabbis, which actually lasts almost into the modern period, except the rabbis never rule entirely on their own because they need to have some kind of relationship with the secular powers around them. And so there's two ways that happens. In the earlier period, in the early Middle Ages, you have a character in Aramaic known as the Reish Galuta, or the head of the exile. He claims descent from the line of King David. He's almost a political figure. So in Babylon, or in Baghdad at the time, the Jews called it Babylon still, under the caliphates, you had three major figures. You had the heads of the two major rabbinical academies, and you had this Reish Galuta, the exilarch.
Sort of like the imam or something.
Well, but it's not a priest as much as a political representative of the Jews to the Muslim empire.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And he would be affirmed by the caliph, and often there were rivalries of different, claimants to the throne over who gets to be the next Reish Galuta. But it was a kind of a king of the Jews in exile dynamic, a political address for Jewish negotiations and foreign relations, so to speak.
So then the rabbis had no political?
No, they did, because remember that it was a troika that ruled. You had the Reish Galuta, and you had the head of the two rabbinical academies.
Oh, so they had political.
They had some political sways too. They could authorize, they could work together to choose the next Reish Galuta who's coming in, and they sort of work together.
Also remember that under Islamic rule, you have these communities that are, recognize the Jewish and Christian communities, and they have leaders that have political power within the community.
Right, and certainly under the Ottoman Empire, you have what's called the millet system, where there's a chief rabbi that is in charge of Jews all throughout the empire, so that Jews don't have to go to an imam to get married. They can go to a rabbi, and it's recognized by the state. But what happens in the Middle Ages to the late Middle Ages is you get a new kind of power within the Jewish community, and this is the power of affluence. You get people with money, people with means, people with connections, and they begin to exert some authority as well. In Eastern Europe, for example, there's a community organization called the Kehillah, which is a Jewish self-governing organization where they would tax themselves and pay a lump tax to the Lord or to the national government. And they could decide their own affairs internally. The Kehillah would hire the rabbi, who would then decide issues of Jewish law. And often the people with the money would marry their daughters in with rabbis because there was a status to marrying a scholar. And then the rabbis now are part of these wealthy families, and it becomes sort of a, again, the socialists would say a vicious circle. The capitalists would say it's a meritocracy because the smart people can marry into the rich families and then everything's justified. But the form of government I call this is, well, you have to know the Yiddish word macher, which means a mover, shaker, someone who gets things done, like machen in German. And so I call this kind of government democracy, because it's ruled by the machers, right? It's not really democracy as we think it. It's ruled by the movers and shakers and the rabbinic authorities that are working in hand with them. So if you want to make a political joke, democracy works. Now, that's more or less how Jewish self-governance ran until the modern period, where they had experience with democracies. And all of a sudden, they can vote for their representatives. And they have a separation of religion and government. So they don't have an official chief rabbi or a appointed rabbi for the city who's in charge of all the Jews in the city. Now you can form your own synagogue with your own rabbi and your own style of Jewishness. The birth of the Reform movement happens in the early 19th century and reflects that freedom of association that we now take for granted. And that diminishes the power of the organized Jewish community to tell Jews what to do. Also, remember, when Jews are emancipated, their right of residence, their taxation is not run through a Jewish umbrella organization. Now it's run directly to the government because you're an individual citizen. Oh, that's a new concept. Just being a citizen of a country, and you happen to be Jewish. So Jews had to kind of redefine what their Jewishness meant, because it wasn't a national self-contained community like in the ghettos in Venice or in the Eastern European shtetl. Now they were individual citizens, and their Jewishness had to fit into acceptable categories. So maybe it became just a religion. Or maybe they were an ethnic minority in a sea of ethnic minorities, like in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It made sense because there were lots of ethnic minorities in the Austro-Hungarian Empire that were all citizens of the state that didn't really give them a lot of rights anyway. I mean, it gave them some rights of personal religion and behavior, but they couldn't vote for the emperor because he was the emperor. So that's the way it went. But actually, Emperor Franz Joseph, who ruled from like 1842 to
1848 to 1916.
1916, right? So he ruled for almost 68 years. I mean, that's quite a run. The Jews loved him. They loved him because he was supportive of their economic opportunities, because he protected them from conversionary influences and reactionary politics. They loved Franz Joseph.
Yeah, remember, he came in on the Revolution of 1848.
After that, right.
Yeah, that was one of the reasons. So his support, I mean, that was also a political decision by him. But nonetheless, yeah.
Right, exactly. So
he was enlightened, relatively speaking.
The enlightened emperor, right, was a good model compared to, let's say, the czars next door. They hated the czars, right? Yeah. So, stability is one thing and opportunity is another. But neither of those were really the model that Jews in Western Europe or Jews in America experienced, which was really democracy and freedom and the chance to run their own affairs. So in general, Jews tended to support a few different political options. Some of them wound up supporting liberal democracy as the best solution for them. Very few of them were conservative or reactionary, because that tended to be very Christian, tended to be very almost feudalistic, its understanding of class society. It was very romantic nationalist in a way that often excluded Jews from German nationalism or Russian nationalism. And it also wasn't progressive economically, and Jews tended to be on the bottom of the economic scale. Certainly the proletariat in Eastern Europe was. Most Jews were poor in Eastern Europe. But that did mean that some Jews were attracted to radical political solutions. Mm-hmm. So while some were open to the liberal democratic approach of integration and participating in democracy, other Jews said that we have to solve this problem in a radical way.
Marx.
And so you think of Marx with a Jewish heritage. I don't know if he identified as Jewish in any way, but certainly the Jewish socialists that were involved. Think about, Trotsky is born Jewish and raised that way, and plenty of the others of the early communist circles were. In fact, there were actually arguments between different styles of secularized Jews getting involved in politics over what the best strategy was. Was the best strategy a revolution that would overturn society and undermine the capitalist basis for anti-Semitism, and that would be the best answer for the Jews and everyone? Is the best answer a liberal democracy that allows Jews to become citizens and vote and have rights like other individuals, and that will solve the problem of Jewish separateness and hatred? Or is the solution to say Jewish hatred's endemic to Western Europe or to Eastern Europe or to just the non-Jewish world, and we need our own Jewish state? And if we want to make it socialist, fine, we can do that, but the most important thing is we need our own state. So that's the line between the integrationists, the sort of bourgeois liberal Democrats, the socialists and communists, and the Zionists, who are all trying to solve the same problem, but who have radically different solutions to that problem. Now, that's sort of a history of Jewish political options and choices, and we'll talk a little bit more about that on the action side of things. But there's also, on the philosophical level, the political theory question of what is the best way to organize society. Aristotle talks about this, and many other political thinkers since have as well. You have the concept of monarchy, which is ruled by one person. And as Aristotle describes it, it can go really, really well, or it can go really, really terrible. The best model is the enlightened monarch, right? The benevolent dictator. The worst model is the tyrant, who has all the power of the benevolent dictator and none of the good will. So you think of Marcus Aurelius, who's thought of as the very enlightened Roman emperor. And he was a philosopher, and he wanted the best for his subjects, and he expanded the Roman Empire, and still condoned slavery and all kinds of other things. And then you think about Nero or other emperors, or Caligula, or the other way. So Aristotle says it's sort of high risk, high reward, to go with one person in charge. Make the trains run on time, but where are the trains running? Second option is government by the few. And there are a couple different models for this. You could have like a cabal or junta, right, which is government by the corrupt, or government by the power hungry. You could have an aristocracy, which is thought of as government by the nobles or the elites. And honestly, Athenian democracy was more or less like this, because you had to be a landowner, and you couldn't be a woman or a slave, and you had to be a citizen.
The Roman Republic was like that.
The Roman Republic was absolutely like that, right? You have the Senate and so on. So the idea of government by the few is a model that has been thought to be successful. I mean, you can think of like, a meritocracy of the bureaucracy, enlightened bureaucrats running things, or
Confucianism is basically that idea.
Right. Or the Kennedy cabinet of all these Ivy Leaguers and so on. People thought of that as like the few, the smart running everything. Now that can also go astray in other ways. You can have something called oligarchy, which is ruled by the rich, who are not necessarily there because of their smarts or their goodwill.
Russia.
They're simply there. In fact, one of the reasons why the chief executive in Athenian democracy was chosen by lot was they were worried about the influence of money in politics and the idea of the rich getting in charge, making the rules that benefit them to put them in power forever. Now, you also have the concept of government by the people. That's democracy, like demos, like demography, right?
What's a plutocracy?
Plutocracy, I think it's another word for oligarchy.
Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, plutocracy is basically another word.
Another word. Yeah, it's probably like Latin versus Greek roots or something.
Well, we were always accused of that in like the early 20th century, late 19th century, that
right, it was a plutocracy.
Well, in some ways we were, because guys like Rockefeller and Vanderbilt, whatever, basically controlled what Congress. I mean, so they ran it. One could say these days too, but the early American republic is not really a democracy. It's more of a.
Of course,
it's more of a plutocracy.
Right, because many states required landowning to be able to vote. Against slavery, women, Native Americans not getting the opportunity. The whole idea of the electoral college with the electors who know better than the people.
And the Senate also.
And the Senate used to be
right, and the Senate was chosen by state government and not directly elected. And so look, our people point to our system as a model, but when did we really become democratic?
1912.
1960s. Because before the Civil Rights era, before the Voting Rights Act, could you really call it a democracy? And don't forget, Native Americans didn't fully get the vote till later in the 20s, like 28 or 30.
24, I think.
Yes, it was later. Not even
when they went from subjects to citizens.
Right. So calling us a democracy when 1/5 of the population was eligible to vote, I don't know. It's a sliding scale. So maybe in the 1860s where black men get the chance to vote. Okay, it's better, but it's still not there. 1920, women get a chance to vote, but most black women in the South are not getting a chance to vote, and black men in the South for that matter either. So it's a shifting scale. Chinese-born individuals aren't able to become citizens for a long time. So we're
that doesn't change until
much later.
Much later.
Yeah. So it's a work in progress.
You could say whether it's changed at all, actually.
Yes. Well, it has changed. You can't say it's the same as it was in the 1840s, but
you can also say we haven't really got to be a democracy yet either.
Okay. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, though, is that democracy can also be corrupted into rule by the mob, or what's called the dictatorship of the majority, or the tyranny of the majority.
That's right.
That is, if it's only 50% plus one decides anything, then minority rights mean nothing. So you actually need, for an ideal system from our perspective, is you need rule by the people with some checks on that authority, a kind of constitutional democracy, where you have human rights protections versus the tyranny of the majority. Now, there is another option for governance, theoretically, which is anarchy. That's just, well, everybody do what they want. It's, survival
I
of the
never really
fittest.
understand how that's supposed to work. The people that are anarchists, like, who fills the potholes?
I still have a book for you to read. You have to.
See, the issue with anarchy is either you're a survivalist who wants to live in the hills and figure you're stronger than everybody else, or you're an idealist that imagines that people will cooperate without having to worry about it. Now, I remember I got in an argument with somebody online who posted a video of a massive traffic circle in Mexico City, where there are like 8 or 10 streets coming in many different places, and pedestrians are trying to cross in all different directions, and there's no traffic signals, and there's no police, and amazingly, nobody hits anybody. And he says, see, it's working fine. And I said, but these people are like, they're this far away from the pedestrians, and if you had a wheelchair, what would you do? And
exactly the same around the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. I mean, try crossing that street sometime. It's
right.
It's not possible.
But it is a kind of anarchy that does work. It sort of works. It sort of sorts itself out, So sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. It depends on a lot of factors involved. But there are people who take anarchy seriously as a theory, or at least as a direction to move in. Remember, a lot of the political stances people take is they're like the dog chasing the car. If they actually got there, it's like the Republicans with Roe versus Wade. Now they don't know what to do because they actually passed what they had said they were going to do. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
So,
in the 30s, there were villages and small towns in Spain that were ruled by what they call anarcho-syndicalists.
right.
I don't actually know how that works, but evidently it did work for a while, but Franco sort of got rid of all that.
Yeah.
I don't really know first of all, I can't even say it, but it's anarcho-syndicalist.
Syndicalist, yeah.
Something like that.
That also shows up in a Monty Python movie.
Oh, does it?
In Monty Python and the Quest for the Holy Grail, the king comes across this peasant who starts spouting all this political theory about being an anarcho-syndicalist. So and he says we run in a radical commune style where we each take a turn as the executive of the week. We have decisions by consensus. And you see, part of the challenge in deciding what the best political system is what's your scale?
Yeah.
Right? Athenian democracy had like 400 voters at one point, and it was not that big. And you can run on consensus in certain circumstances.
Well, band societies ran kind of like that, little band societies, which never were more than usually 30 people. And
right.
What was the other one I was going to say?
Well, once you see, and the same is true.
The Shakers,
right?
Kind of
Shakers ran that way. Quakers run in a sort of collective judgment style in their religious communities. My understanding is that hunter-gatherer groups are relatively egalitarian because everyone's walking and everyone's traveling, and there's no rich and poor necessarily.
That's what he means by band society.
Yeah, that's what I mean by band
another
society.
name for that,
but that's because foraging societies, which you call hunter-gatherer, but foraging actually can get quite complex and can have chiefs and stuff. So
that's true.
So it's not exactly. That's why they've made out band societies as specifically that, meaning that
it's just a band.
The Northwest Coast Indians were foragers, but they had a lot.
Oh, they had kings and
well, they didn't have kings, but they definitely had hierarchies.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that site in Turkey, Gokul Tepe, or whatever it is, it's an example of monumental architecture at a very surprisingly early period.
Once again, denser populations, and larger.
It gets more complicated, right? So part of the challenge is what's your scale and how representative is it going to be? Is your philosophy, if you have representative democracy, are they simply a button that responds to polling in their district for every time, or do you grant them authority to make their own decisions? And how often do they need to stand for election? I would argue 2 years is too soon, but 6 years is too long. And where do you find the right line there? How do you manage money in politics, and how do you manage special interests, and how do you manage corporations, and how do you manage unions? There's all kinds of variables of how to make democracy work better or make it work less badly. But we're still trying to solve that. In the end, there's no perfect answer. Remember Winston Churchill's line about democracy? Yeah. Is that it's corrupt and inefficient and ineffective and best of the alternatives.
There used to be a takeoff on that. I forget what TV program it was like back in the 60s. It says democracy is a terrible system, but it's way better than anything else.
It was better than anything else we've come up with.
I can't remember what that was, but it was a television program.
Yeah, right.
I don't remember. I remember it, but not the name of it.
Well, and there's a reason why people all over the world have moved into democracies when they can. And there's a reason why people are fighting for freedom in other countries. Look at what's happening in Iran and China right now, where women have had enough with this religious belief. It's not responsive to the people and is imposing it on them despite what they want. And China, the Chinese citizens are rebelling against the zero COVID lockdown system, and it's emblematic of the other restrictions they have to deal with. These pictures of protesters marching with blank pieces of paper.
I know, that's really clever.
That's really, really clever, because what are you going to tell? What did I do wrong? I have a blank piece of paper. But, and actually, I think it was in Singapore, they actually banned selling paper because people were.
Did they really? Wow.
Yeah. I mean, what kind of society bans
that
paper?
That wouldn't be Singapore.
No, it's Shanghai.
Well, maybe it was Shanghai.
Yeah, because for Singapore actually is very different.
Well, the Russian protesters invented that.
Yeah.
The ones that were protesting
the war, right?
But there's protesting. Russia's having more protests as well.
Right. So people. I mean, as much as the trend has gone, not always in democracy's favor in the last decade or so, there are still lots of people that feel it's the best of the alternatives available. Okay, so that's on the organization. How do we structure society? In general, Humanistic Judaism would follow a democracy with some limitations on the rule of the majority human rights system. Now, once you've organized your society, be it a congregation or a social group or a political party or a nation state, whatever scale you're talking, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to direct its actions in a sense of ethical behavior, doing what you think is good? There's a new movement now in response to the religious right that calls itself the religious left. It's organized by people who are religious in many cases, but who say that their religion motivates them to argue for more support for the poor and for reforming prison systems and the justice system and for affirmative action and for other kinds of means to address the wrongs they see in society, which they see as moral wrongs, not just as practical economic issues or as political things to be debated. They see it as a moral issue on which they don't see another side as being moral. And what gets complicated about this is that the line between what's just political and what's ethical and moral is harder and harder to define. Now, some of that comes from the religious right trying to make political issues out of social concerns, like what a marriage is, and who gets to adopt a child, and should religion be involved in the public square, and to what degree? Should your religious beliefs exempt you from anti-discrimination protections?
Which is
the case that's going on right now. So they're pushing in one direction, and so when we push back to say that a family is a family and love should be recognized regardless of the genders of the people involved, it becomes a political issue on our side as well, but it's also a moral issue of allowing people to decide their own lives and choose their partners. And just as we support interracial marriage or intercultural marriage between Jews and non-Jews, we would do the same for same-sex partnerships. So there is a kind of religious left movement pushing back, whether it's from a kind of liberal Protestant or liberal Reform Jewish theological perspective or from a more secular perspective. It's still using our values to drive our political advocacy and not just saying it makes more political sense in an economic understanding. And after all, even economics aren't necessarily value neutral. What do you privilege? Do you privilege the worker, or do you privilege the owner? Do you privilege collective action? Do you privilege, the corporate action? Do you, how far do you go on regulations and permitting for the social impact of an environmentally sensitive area versus the economic opportunity to drill or to build in a particular place? How far do you go on zoning laws? You know, private property is a right, but not impacting your neighbors is also an important consideration. So you have to find the right balance. And the other factor that we have to keep in mind when we're deciding what to do is to have a kind of humanist realism. Part of our approach to truth is, what does science say? What does the evidence say? Part of our approach to ethics is, what are the consequences? Well, we have to fairly evaluate the consequence. And if, let's say, the housing projects of the Great Society initiative in the 1960s turned out to be disasters for private ownership and for initiative and for self-sufficiency and for asset building and for all these other factors, we need to be willing to say that didn't work and we actually caused harm. Even if the intent was good, you have to look at what the results are. It's not just the intent. Now, that also applies to discriminatory behavior. If you set up a system, for example, where paying your rent on time does not affect your credit score, which is actually the way the credit scores work, then that makes it harder for renters to build positive credit to be able to then afford a mortgage because they get a lower interest rate. So if you did count on-time rent payments as toward a credit score, it would be more egalitarian in building credit and help people in a lower end of the socioeconomic scale as opposed to those on a higher end. I actually saw another example just recently that was, it slipped my mind, where it was counting a certain kind of behavior as economically beneficial and another one not, that it was benefiting those who already had the assets. But you know, think about mortgage deductions from taxes and all kinds of factors like that that are not necessarily egalitarian. There's an ethics behind
real estate stuff, inheritance taxes.
Inheritance taxes, exactly, right. You could make a moral judgment one way or the other on that. Do you prioritize public need, private property, egalitarianism, etc.? But we have to look at the impact on this, and we also have to accept that there's no truth monopoly on either side of the political aisle. That is, sometimes there are insights that come from the other side, whatever side you happen to be on, that are worth listening to, and that might have a better solution. Sometimes the private market is, or the private enterprise or the free market is a better solution to solving some issues than government intervention. I had one friend who once said, I wish libertarians were as suspicious of corporations, were more suspicious of corporations, and I wish Democrats or progressives were more suspicious of government. You know, that libertarians hate government and progressives tend to be suspicious of corporations, but if they could trust corporations a little bit more, and if the libertarians could trust the government a little bit more and be more suspicious of the ones they tend to rely on, then you know, they might be able to see some of the flaws in their own attempts to solve problems. So this is where we have to accept that if we're looking at consequences and reality, that sometimes the answers are going to be somewhere else. So in our book, The Basic Ideas of Secular Humanistic Judaism, there's a whole section on social ethics in it. And the author, Eva Goldfinger, lists a whole series of ethical positions of secular humanistic Judaism. But what I find interesting on this list is that a lot of them are what we might call political issues. So she's framing it as social ethical issues. So for example, the environment. We have to protect our planet. We have to work to repair and reverse the damage we've caused. Now, is that pragmatic? To some extent, but there's also a sense that human survival is an ethical value, and so we have to act on that. Euthanasia, that's an issue that gets voted on, right? Dignity in dying, it's a political issue that has to get passed in government, but we see it also as an ethical issue that people have the freedom to choose a death with dignity. Intercultural marriage, again, everyone has the right to choose their own marriage partner. Lifestyle relationship choices, to choose to be single or be a family with any number of parents or two or more family groupings. This is not our job to decide that. That's the ethical freedom of the people involved to choose that. Racism under any guise undermines human dignity and the right to life and liberty. So we're anti-racist and we're anti-Semite. Reproductive choice. Women should have absolute control over their own bodies. And that's, again, a moral value for us that becomes a political issue when it comes before a voting body. Sexual orientation, people have the right to personally express that. The idea of a just society is an important ethical value for us. We oppose tyranny and oppression because, again, understanding both the Jewish historical experience of suffering under tyranny, but also the idea of the dignity of the individual to fully express themselves doesn't happen under tyranny. The balance of universalism and particularism, which we'll talk more about when we get to the Jewish side of questions. So these are all ethical values, but they often have political implications. And I'll give you one example based on the discussion we had last time on ethics. Remember, there were all those categories of moral reasoning. Does this hurt somebody or help somebody? And is this fair? Is this cheating? What I often see in political debates, yes, we'll actually talk about affirmative action in a little bit. Thanks, Alan. What I often see in political debates is those two values of fairness and cheating and hurting or helping people in conflict with each other based on which do you think is more important. So take an example of giving out welfare or COVID emergency aid or universal basic income, okay? Those on the care harm side say, I would rather some people get it who might not deserve it than exclude someone who really could use it. So my priority is avoiding the harming people and helping, and I want to help people. And if a few people cheat and get away with it, I'll live with it. On the other side of the political aisle, they are very concerned about people cheating and people getting it who don't deserve it and people being lazy and people not working and earning what they should get. And they're okay for helping people sometimes, like unemployment insurance and things like that, but they want them to really deserve it. And so they would rather exclude people who might need it but can't justify it, or because their priority is preventing people from cheating the system. They want it to be fair more than they're worried about harming people. So they're both ethical positions of the emphasizing cheating or emphasizing the hurting people, but they wind up on different sides of the political aisle because of their priority and how they want to enact this particular style of legislation. So when we understand these issues are both ethical and political, now we can see that pattern of Jewish political behavior in the world. Now I will say that looking specifically at cultural and secular Jews, they tended to be on the more radical side of the political spectrum. After all, if they were radical theologically, it made sense also. And remember what Marx said about religion, right? The opiate of the masses. It puts them in a stupor and then they acquiesce. Liberal bourgeois Jews tended to be the reform movement, a little bit more respectable. You know, they were worried about what their neighbors thought of them, so they would have a religious institution that would pass muster. The radical socialists didn't care. So they were willing to run a secular Yiddish shula or a radical commune or have a Yiddish-speaking summer camp, and they were less interested in assimilation to that degree and more interested in their political issues. So you had actually multiple styles of socialist Jewish options to explore your identity, to educate your kids and send them to summer camp. You had the Bund, which was a sort of left-wing socialist but not communist. You had the International Workers' Order, which was pro-communist and pro-Soviet. You had the labor Zionist movement, which was socialist but pro-nationalist and not internationalist. And disagreed on the question of, should we be distinctly Jewish or should we just be, we happen to be Jewish and we're part of the International Workers' Order. And those were intense arguments, but looking back now, it's like the People's Front of Judea, the Judean People's Front, they're all socialists, they're all secular, they're all Jewish, but they have a few issues that divide them strongly. Today, in the Jewish world, you do still have, in the religious world, some more conservative political perspectives. In fact, in the Trump years, it's been a really stark divide where the Orthodox Jewish world has become much more pro-Republican, where the conservative, Reform, and secular Jewish world tend to be much more pro-Democrat. It's really split the Jewish community. But within the secular Jewish world, there's still a couple different flavors involved. In general, there's a balance between two trends: the libertarian individuals in charge of themselves and gets to make their own choices direction, and the idea of social responsibility, that we have to give of our own to be part of the collective, and we have to restrict our own freedoms to help others. And so there's that balancing of those two extremes. Both are positive values, again, you know, letting individuals be in charge of their own life, that's important. I would support, for example, death with dignity. That's a libertarian perspective. Drug legalization is a libertarian perspective. Absolute property rights to do whatever you want, well, that's also a libertarian perspective that I might limit because I'm annoyed enough with my neighbor's dogs barking at all hours of the night, let alone him building a high rise next to my house, okay? So I'm allowed to have some input there. Oversimplified, both the libertarian and the sort of collectivist model are socially liberal, you know, on drug issues, on gay marriage issues, things like that. They might disagree on economic freedoms, just depends on how you draw the chart, you know, and where you put the freedom line. Ultimately, though, humanists and humanistic Jews do still have this key concept of human rights, that there's something about the Jewish experience and our philosophy that motivates us to work for the betterment of society. So I'm going to share a document here. Let me just pull that up. Okay, so let me get to the right tab here. This is a statement on social justice. You know, fascinating detail I just realized. So in the book, Basic Ideas of Secular Humanistic Judaism, this social justice statement appears. However, it's not called social justice and affirmative action. It's called just social justice. And they cut out the last paragraph of the original statement. So interesting, like I hear the argument going between the author and the people who wrote this statement, and who, you know, so the author chopped off the last paragraph she didn't like and and changed the title of the statement. It's in the appendix in the back.
That's okay, too.
Yeah, we got it on the screen, right? So here are some examples of this basic statement. Let me just switch the pin here. Okay. So we secular Jews base our commitment to social justice on our understanding of Jewish ethics, of Jewish history, and the traditions of our movement. And this CSGO group came out of the Jewish socialist world. That's where their organizations had their roots. From an ethical standpoint, we're inspired by the insistence of our people's prophets. The essence of morality is the establishment of justice, so that's a claim to Jewish textual tradition. We see a historical imperative in the fact that through the ages, Jewish security and participation in any society has been determined by the degree of justice in that society and its relative freedom from violence. We honor and share in the century-long tradition of secular Jewish movements in their struggle for peace and the right of the oppressed, the dispossessed and defenseless, and our movement's affirmation of the sanctity of life. Not in the pro-life meaning, but in the individual's life, right? So this is drawing on Jewish traditions of these particular statements and these values. And these considerations commit us to building a society that affirms, protects, and champions the right of all people, especially the oppressed, including the poor, political and ideological dissidents, women, children, ethnic and racial minorities, the disabled, lesbians, and gays. And it also talks about ecology. Our commitments are not altruistic. They are our self-interested concern with the world. So this is all making that libertarian argument too, that it's not just you have to give to everybody. It's just in your own personal interest. You as the individual should be concerned with these kind of issues. And then the last paragraph talks specifically about affirmative action, where the upper part is more general, focused on struggling for social justice. But these are all statements of basic rights and responsibilities of people acting out there in the world, and they will affect how you're going to vote on particular issues, what kind of community service projects you might choose to do, and how you would choose to organize that. I will mention that historically, Kol Hadash and its predecessor Congregation Beth Or, actually were not that involved in community service activity for its Kol Hadash's early years in Beth Or at all, because their rabbi, Dan Friedman, took a more libertarian perspective. He said, if you want to help people, you go help people, but the group is not going to speak for you in that way. When I came to Kol Hadash, we had both people who wanted to do more in a community service direction and people who didn't want us to do very much at all. And so the cut the baby in half solution I came up with was we would create a community service committee that would do non-political community service. We wouldn't do social action in terms of advocating for political positions and signing petitions and marching in protests and all that stuff, because we might not have a consensus on it. But we could find non-controversial helping people things like collecting food or clothing, basic human needs, right? Books. Well, we began expanding it over time to include toiletries for families of service people overseas and books for literacy. And, you know, we expanded what basic needs are from just food, clothing, shelter. And now we even have shifted even further because our community service committee a few years ago reframed itself as values in action. If you think about the name of that, that's what we're talking about here. That we have our values and now we're going to act on those, whether it's helping each other within the community or helping people outside the community. Now, we still tend not to march in marches or send out petitions to sign and do that kind of activism. And in some ways, we're an outlier. Other humanistic Jewish communities are much more active on voting rights issues, on gun control issues, they will march and they will sign petitions on those kind of things, more so than we have historically. So I'm not saying that our model is the only way to do it, but we're trying to find that balance within our community and its population of what brings us together, and what actions can we share and work on together. And on some level, any group has to do that. Now, I don't expect a group to do what I want all the time. If a group agrees with me 80% of the time, it's worth it. In December, we're making our final decisions for charity donations in the year. And do I agree with everything the ACLU does? No, not necessarily. You might be surprised, actually. The ACLU filed a brief in support of the website designer of the designing websites for gay couples issue on the issue of free expression and individual freedom. And so, it's not where I would have expected them to fall on that issue.
ACLU does just occasionally do things like that troubles me because,
so you have to decide, if I agree with them 80% of the time, is it still, they also defended a conscientious objector to the Gulf War who was in the Army Reserves. I said, well, if you signed up for the Army, you don't necessarily get to pick which wars you're going to. If you were being drafted, I could understand it, but...
Well, they've also supported the right of hate groups to march.
And the right of hate groups to march, right. There's many issues we may disagree, but they do enough good on enough issues that it's worth supporting for me. And so that's sort of my philosophy of a community doing community service or social action. If you can get a 70, 80% consensus, that it's worth doing, and hopefully the people who disagree with the particular issue you've chosen are willing to agree to disagree on that topic because there's enough positive they do support. That's why we started with helping battered women and children. Who's gonna say they disagree with doing that, right? Well, maybe some, but
the husband.
I was gonna say the batterer.
Maybe the batterer, right? But we try to find again that common ground and move forward together as best we can.